Good morning. Welcome to our Research Ethics to Advanced Health Equity Symposium. To provide some introductory remarks, I'd like to call upon F. Charles Brunicardi, Dean of the College of Medicine and Senior Vice President of SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University.
Thank you, Dean Lazar. Good morning, everyone. On behalf of President Riley and SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University, I'd like to welcome everyone, those who are here in person and those who are joining us via live stream. Welcome to the Research Ethics to Advance Health Equity Symposium, which is being sponsored by the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities at Downstate. Our special thanks go to the John Connolly Foundation for Ethics and Philosophy in Medicine for their generous support of our Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities, which they have supported since their first gift to us in 2002. Dr. John Connolly, a pioneer in treating head and neck cancers who trained at Kings County Hospital, was a very good friend of our former chair of otolaryngology, Dr. Frank Lucenti. It is through this lifelong friendship that Dr. Lucenti had with Dr. Connolly and his wife, Dr. Monica Connolly, that we were able to showcase the work that was being done by Dr. Kathleen Powderly in medical ethics. This led to the establishment of the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities. The partnership with the Connolly family and Dr. Powderly is why our program in medical ethics is as strong as it is today. Because of this support, we have continued to conduct critically important work through the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities. Our Connolly Scholars and faculty continue to be active teachers, advocates, and researchers who view bioethics as a critical field of study. And in these very challenging times for healthcare, high-quality activities focused on ethics, addressing the structural determinants of health, reducing health disparities, and promoting health equity are even more important and in great demand. Today's symposium will address some of these important issues. And today's symposium is a special tribute to Dr. Kathleen Powderly, who passed away 1 year ago. You will hear more about Dr. Powderly later in the program by Dr. Jason Lazar. I look forward to hearing the presentations from members of our faculty and from the Connolly Scholars. Thank you, everyone.
I'd like to call up Dr. David Christini, our Senior Vice President for Research and Interim Dean of the School of Graduate Studies.
Thank you, Deans Brunicardi and Lazar, for having the idea to put together this symposium and for making it happen. It's really a fantastic idea. I think the title of the symposium, to me, Research Ethics to Advance Health Equity, really underscores what is so valuable and special about SUNY Downstate. It's this health equity and how research ethics inform health equity really underscore what this place is about. It's really central to our mission as an institution, and it's what we, on the research side of things, are really focusing on as we grow and really further develop our research. And I think that is demonstrated by our two key speakers today, both of whom we successfully recruited to Downstate in the last year and a half, and we are absolutely thrilled about, Professors Peterson and Lambert. Thank you both, Roseanne and Marcus, for taking the time to put together these talks and for joining us here at SUNY Downstate as we try to really continue to advance what we are really well set up to do here at Downstate. Just one more, we have a great program overall. I'd just like to make one more comment that about an aspect that I'd like to highlight. I'm particularly excited about to hear from the trainees and the students, the Connolly Scholars. In my view, any symposium or conference should be highlighted by and have a significant component from trainees, because they really are, I know it's cliche, but they really are our future, and the excitement about what they bring to the table is always it's reinvigorating for all of us. So with that, I'll hand it back to Dean Lazar, and thank you all. I look forward to the symposium.
I am Jason Lazar. I'm the Vice Dean of Education, and I have the honor also of serving as the Chair of the Department of Medical Education. Today I have an additional honor, and that is to present some reflections about Dr. Kathleen Powderly. On behalf of the College of Medicine and the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities, it is with bittersweetness that we remember and we honor our dear colleague and friend, Dr. Kathy Powderly, who passed away almost exactly a year ago. Dr. Powderly was a medical educator, a clinical ethicist, a medical historian, and a nurse midwife. She was an associate professor in the College of Medicine as well as School of Health Professions, and director of the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities here at Downstate, where she began working in 1989. In addition, she held cross appointments in the College of Nursing as well. Through Dr. Powderly's leadership and the generous support of the John Connolly Foundation for Ethics and Philosophy in Medicine, the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities has and continues to be responsible for the teaching of ethics and professionalism across the entire Downstate campus, and in particular the College of Medicine and the School of Graduate Studies. Through her efforts, the John Connolly Division of Medical Ethics and Humanities coordinated a robust program of visiting professors, lectureships, Connolly Scholars events, and a variety of student programs. These programs allowed faculty and students to explore critical issues in the field of ethics and professionalism in medicine. She served as a clinical ethicist and vice chair of the Ethics Committee at University Hospital of Brooklyn and at Kings County Hospital Center, and an ethicist on the Institutional Review Board at SUNY Downstate. Dr. Powderly was a member of the advisory board of the Master's Program in Bioethics at Columbia, a fellow of the New York Academy of Medicine and the Hastings Center, a member of the Council of Ethics Committee Chairs of New York City Health and Hospitals, and an advisor to the Ethics Committee of the American College of Nurse Midwives. Kathy was a member of the Association of Bioethics Program Directors and served as one of its representatives to the Council of Faculty and Academic Societies of the Association of American Medical Colleges. Kathy also served as chair of the Subcommittee on Faculty-Student Relations of the Executive Committee of the Faculty and Professional Staff at the College of Medicine. And in that regard, I had the pleasure and the honor of serving along with her. She was appointed to the SUNY University Faculty Senate Ethics Committee and co-chaired the Senate's Subcommittee on COVID. Dr. Powderly was a member of the advisory board of the student-run Brooklyn Free Clinic and was appointed to the Brooklyn Health Disparity Center Advisory Board, a joint venture between Downstate, the Brooklyn Borough President's Office, and the Arthur Ashe Institute for Urban Health. She earned a BS in nursing at Niagara University, a master's degree in nurse midwifery at Yale University, and PhD degrees in socio-medical sciences at Columbia University. SUNY Downstate Health Sciences University continues to experience the loss of an exceptional medical educator, a clinical ethicist, a valued colleague, and a dear friend to many. The impact that she has had on our campus was profound and will long be remembered. We miss her dearly. And now I have the pleasure of introducing our now I have the pleasure of introducing Dr. Marcus Lambert, our Associate Vice President for Research Strategy and Operations, who will speak on the topic of what Henrietta Lacks teaches us about research ethics. Dr. Lambert.
Good morning. In 1951, an African-American woman named Henrietta Lacks was diagnosed with cervical cancer, a cervical adenocarcinoma. She was treated at Johns Hopkins University, where a doctor named George Guy obtained a tissue sample from her cervix without her consent. Dr. Guy discovered that her cells could not only be kept alive, but would also grow indefinitely. We all owe a great debt to Ms. Henrietta Lacks, because for the past 70 years, her cells, known as HeLa cells, have been cultured and used in experiments ranging from the long-term effects of radiation to the testing of live polio vaccine. Economic analysts believe that the use of HeLa cells have saved the U.S. $180 billion in medical costs in the development of polio vaccine. These cells have shaped the policies of countries, presidents. They were involved in the Cold War. They've gone to space to better understand the impact of zero gravity on human cells. And most recently, the groundbreaking study that identified the infectivity of the virus SARS-CoV-2 in humans did so using the cells that were isolated from Henrietta Lacks. However, there are a number of ethical issues that arise in her story. Her story raises deep questions about informed consent, privacy and confidentiality, commercialization, access to research results, large-scale data sharing, and the ability to withdraw from studies. The story of Henrietta Lacks also illustrates the racial inequities that are embedded in U.S. research and the U.S. healthcare system. Ms. Lacks was a black woman. The hospital where her cells were collected was one of only few that provided medical care to black people at the time. According to a recent Nature article from 2020, none of the biotechnology or other companies that have profited from her cells gave any money back to her family. And for decades after her death, physicians and researchers repeatedly failed to ask her family for consent, as they revealed that Lacks' family name publicly, gave out her medical records to the media, and published her cells' genome online. So, it only feels fitting to begin a symposium on research ethics to advance health equity with the story of Henrietta Lacks, as a reminder of how far we've come and how much further we need to go. Thanks in large part to Dr. Kathleen Powderly, Dr. Booten Foster, and others, Downstate is no stranger to the story of Henrietta Lacks. Just 3 years ago, we had the pleasure of hosting Mr. Alfred Lacks Carter, Jr., one of the grandsons of Henrietta Lacks. And if you go and watch that YouTube presentation or that video, one of the things that he said that day that really struck me, he said, the advances that we're making from the HeLa cells are great, but remember, those HeLa cells came from a human being, a mother of 5 children, a wife, a grandmother, so please respect that. So I want to take a moment today to reflect on the story, the ethics, but also the human being. Her story starts in 1860 when a plantation owner in Virginia named Benjamin Lacks took a black mistress from among his slaves. Henrietta Lacks was his great-grandmother. Henrietta Lacks was born Loretta Pleasant on August 1st, 1920 in Roanoke, Virginia. In 1942, Henrietta Lacks decided to move to Baltimore. She was known affectionately as Henny, as is remembered as having hazel eyes, a small waist, size 6 shoes, and always wearing red nail polish and a pleated skirt. On January 29, 1951, Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins, the only hospital in the area that treated black patients, although it was segregated, because she felt that she had a knot in her womb. She was also pregnant. Dr. Howard Jones was the first to treat Henrietta. He treated her using radium tube inserts, and Alfred, her grandson, described this as burning his grandmother from the inside out. On August 8, 1951, Henrietta went to Johns Hopkins for a routine treatment visit and asked to be admitted due to severe abdominal pain. She received blood transfusions and remained at the hospital until her death on October 4, 1951, at the very young age of 31. Meanwhile, Dr. George Guy, head of tissue culture research at Johns Hopkins University, was trying to cure cancer. He wanted to be the first to successfully grow cancer cells in the lab, and all of his attempts up until thus far had failed, until he received a tissue sample from Dr. Jones. Henrietta did sign a consent form that said, I quote, "I hereby give consent to the staff of the Johns Hopkins University Hospital to perform any operative procedures under any anesthetic, either local or general, that may deem necessary in the proper surgical care and treatment of blank," and then you would fill in the blank. But that was never filled in. And this is where I often ask my students, based on this statement, do you believe that Dr. Guy had the right to obtain a sample from her cervix to use in his research? I would also ask my students, how do you think Henrietta's experiences thus far in the medical system has been, and would it have been different if she were a white woman? Dr. Guy went on TV shortly after her passing to talk about his findings of developing a new cell line. He then sent his assistant, Mary, down to the morgue to acquire more cells from her body. Mary said that in doing so, she couldn't look at the face of Henrietta Lacks. The only thing that she looked at was her nail polish on her toes, and realized that this was a real person. Dr. Guy gave the cells a code name, HeLa, H-E-L-A. He told everyone that they came from a woman, Helene Lane, and distributed them pretty widely. The HeLa cell line started to be in high demand and began to be mass-produced in cell production factories in 1954, and then mailed to scientists around the world for countless uses. As other cell lines began to be developed, it was realized that HeLa cells were actually contaminating other cells. In 1966, one scientist examined many of the cell lines out there and found that they excreted a certain type of enzyme. This enzyme was only found in African Americans. So the suspicion was that these were HeLa cells. So it turns out that they were actually wrong about many of the cell lines that they were working in, whether they were lung, breast, kidney cells. They were actually, in fact, HeLa cells, because they had been contaminated. Over 100 cell lines that were thought to be other types of cell lines were actually contaminated with HeLa cells. This was known as the HeLa bomb. Just one HeLa cell could grow and multiply faster than its host and contaminate the other cells. They discovered HeLa cells almost everywhere, in places that were in high security buildings, places where HeLa cells were never even allowed. People realized that publications using, for example, breast cells were not actually based on breast cells. Many believed that cancer was caused by a virus. And a cancer crusade started, and in 1971, President Nixon announced a war on cancer. And in 1972, Russian scientists claimed that they had found a human cancer virus. They had said that they had found this cancer virus in 5 different cell lines. Now, this was a very big deal. They invited American scientists to visit Russia to learn about the discovery. Cells were sent to America for testing. They turned out to be HeLa cells. And the virus actually was a harmless monkey virus. A new hypothesis was that cancer was not caused by a virus, but was genetic in origin. Genes had not been mapped before, so scientists wanted to study the families of those genes and genetics. It was around 1976. So scientists actually reached out to the family of Henrietta Lacks. They told the family that they wanted to see if what Henrietta had was hereditary and that her cells were actually still alive. Now, this was the first time that the family had been contacted in about 25 years. And the way that her husband understood the phone call was that, Mr. Lacks, we've got your wife. She's alive in a laboratory. We've been doing research on her for the last 25 years, and now we have to test your kids to see if they have cancer. So there was a bit of a disconnect there. But I think this entire story thus far really points to the evolution of medical ethics and all of the equitable considerations that go into human subjects research. The most striking to me is this: community input, and the approach that elevates shared interests, not just those of scientists, but shared interests of the people that they impact. I really look forward to the discussions today that not only advance our understanding of important ethical considerations, but Downstate's unique feature in our approach to clinical research, and that is this: we have a long-standing relationship with our community. The question is, how will we leverage this as we advance health equity and translational research? Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Lambert. Next, I'd like to call upon Dr. Thomas Mackey, Chair of Health Policy and Management, Associate Professor, Director of Public Health and Hospital Relations in our School of Public Health, as well as the panel members that Dr. Mackey will introduce. Dr. Mackey.
Wonderful to be with you here all today and to have the distinct pleasure to introduce our panel. I don't think that Dr. Christini could have said it better when he said that at the core of what we do here is work to advance health equity at Downstate. And I think certainly we do that across our schools and across our colleges here on the Downstate campus. And so in this panel, we've asked individuals from each of our respective schools here at Downstate to come together and to speak with us about their own commitment to research ethic to advance health equity and to what we can think about and learn from the respective professions and the disciplinary orientation that they have in the work that they do in conducting research to advance health equity. So I'll just ask our panelists to please come up and to join me up here at the table. That would be wonderful. Great, and so as we, fantastic. It's really my distinct honor and privilege to introduce such a prestigious panel today to speak about research ethics as it advances their work in health equity. We have from the College of Medicine here at Downstate Health Sciences University, Dr. Carla Booten-Foster, Associate Dean for Diversity Education and Research and Professor of Clinical Medicine. Representing the School of Public Health with us this morning, we have Dr. Marlene Camacho Rivera, Assistant Dean for Student Affairs and Assistant Professor. And we have Dr. Alan Lewis, Dean and Professor in the School of Health Professions. And lastly, of course, but not least, Dr. Mary Claire Roberts, our Associate Professor and Associate Dean of Scholarship in the School of Nursing. And so I'll ask, really, thank you all for joining us today. And I'll ask, we'll start with Dr. Lewis perhaps at the very end, and ask that he speak to just introducing himself a bit more than I have briefly introduced, and also provide us with some reflections on his own research and scholarship and the work within his profession as it relates to health equity and research ethics to advance health equity.
Good morning, all. Thank you, Dr. Mackey, and good morning to my esteemed panelists and to everybody who's here in person and those of us who are joining via live stream. Happy Friday, and this is a great panel. Thank you, Dr. Lambert, for that very inspiring talk. So, as Dean of the School of Health Professions, I have had a long journey to where I am now. I've been in the workforce now for just shy of 40 years. First 15 years in the workforce, I was a clinician, mental health and addiction clinician, and worked as a public servant running state health and mental health services. And then the last 25 years, I've been an academic and have worked at 5 institutions: Virginia Commonwealth University, University of Pittsburgh, Gallaudet in DC, James Madison University in Virginia, and now here. So in the School of Health Professions, we have, well, let me say a few more things about myself. So not that that's that important, but I'm a health services researcher. My background is as a disability rehabilitation counseling clinician, and I'm a health services researcher, so the research that I do really looks at the impact of services primarily on persons with disability, although I do some general health kinds of things as well. And in the School of Health Professions, as you know, we have this buffet of many different professions. We have medical informatics, now called health informatics, occupational therapy, physical therapy, midwifery, physician assistant, and diagnostic medical imaging, which is sonography. And all of our 6 programs, the majority of the research they do is basically health equity research. Now, in our school, I will admit that we're still building our research capacity. We are very clinical in focus, and not all of our faculty are doctorally prepared. So one of our initiatives is to get folks involved in research, so we're building that across the board. And so not everybody is participating at the level that we would want, but people are starting to get going with that, and we're sort of building the culture and asking folks to at least put their toe in the water, so to speak, and be involved in research. In terms of the topic today, as you see on my slides there, I scratched through health, and I probably shouldn't have, but because my identity is more as a disability researcher, although I do health, general health research. And so when you think about the whole notion of health equity, in my mind, almost by definition, that kind of research is going to have some ethical underpinning, because if you think about the idea of the ethical principle of justice, which really speaks to the idea that we're going to provide services and interventions to populations, particularly marginalized populations, in a way that offsets disadvantage. So that means that the type, the intensity, and the amount of services and interventions that people get really matches their level of need and offsets whatever disadvantage they may have. And so that's really leveling the playing field, so to speak. So almost by definition, we're already in the ethical mode if you're doing health equity research. Now, we were asked to give a couple of comments in terms of things that undergird our research, our own research. So I've got 4 things, as you see up there, key ethical considerations. The first one is, and it's an evolving area of research for myself, just beginning this work. I've worked on bias for many years as a clinician and as a researcher, but now I'm beginning to look at it from the point of view of investigators who are doing research, health and disability equity research, to understand the extent to which bias impacts the kind of research they do. And my goal is for researchers to be aware of their cultural biases and to have a game plan to either eliminate them or mitigate their impact on their research, because the biases that we have, the preferences, some of which are harmful, can have a deleterious effect on our research, and particularly with subjects that are from different communities and different cultural perspectives. So the idea is to make sure that we do no harm with the bias, and that's non-maleficence, the ethical principle of non-maleficence, in terms of the way that we conduct the research, but the investigators have to do some work on the front end to really make sure they're identifying, eliminating, and managing their biases. The second point is utilizing a comprehensive framework for conducting disability or health equity research. I think it's important that you use a sort of a stepwise approach, and that you look at a framework that's very comprehensive. In other words, that encompasses pretty much the entire experience of being disabled. And I published a paper in 2009 called the Disability Disparities Model, a Beginning Framework. And in that paper and in that model, I didn't bring the full model today because it looks very busy, but I've excerpted on that second bullet up there the 5 points on the continuum: incidence or the occurrence of disability, contemplation about disability, because we know that marginalized groups oftentimes don't necessarily fully and quickly embrace the formal system of services and care. They typically will want to, first of all, explore indigenous opportunities and options, faith community, and those types of things. And then if there's a decision made to actually access the formal system, the access process can be different because we know there are different help-seeking traditions in various groups. And then once in the system, assuming that has happened, the access has occurred, then folks participate in varying levels based on their historical experience with the system and members of their group, and based on their trust in the system. And then obviously the outcomes get looked at. And outcomes always have to be looked at, obviously, in terms of case mix, the severity, how long people have had whatever it is that they're being treated for. And so this continuum, incidence, contemplation, access, participation, and outcomes, in my mind, represents a broad continuum within the disability area, at least, where if you're going to do research that's going to be ethically grounded, you need to think about where you plug in to a comprehensive framework for understanding the disability experience. My third point is looking at participatory action research. And of course, when you use that, going back to my second point, when you use that broad framework, the principle that you're undergirding there in terms of ethics is beneficent. You're trying to make sure that you're doing what's best and what's of optimal benefit for the client you're serving. Third point is that research must involve the benefactors of research. And this is human subjects research, obviously not bench research, which is the kind of research I do, is the human subjects health services research. And so when you're doing that kind of research, if at all possible, you want to make sure that you have the benefactors, the stakeholders, the recipients of that research involved in the research as much as possible as co-investigators or what have you, from the point of inception of a research idea all the way through the conduct of the research to the point of disseminating those results and findings at the end. And I did a study years ago, or actually haven't done it yet, but it was a proposal for a grant where we looked at the impact of hip-hop on helping young African-American and Latino men understand more about disability. And so I collaborated with a hip-hop group out of Queens. I was not in New York at this time. I was at another institution. And their name is Four Wheel City. They're both African-American and Latino, and they're in wheelchairs, and they do positive hip-hop about violence prevention and disability. And the idea was we put together this proposal where they were co-investigators with me. From the very beginning, they were involved, and we didn't do the research yet, but all the way to the dissemination, they would be equal partners. So that participatory action research, which really does embrace the ethical principle of autonomy, making sure that folks who are the recipients and benefactors of the research have a voice in the research. And finally, I think it's important to use mixed methods methodologies as much as possible, again, in human subjects research, because going back to my previous point, when you use mixed methods methodologies, obviously the qualitative components allow that voice of persons with disabilities to be involved in the research. And when you have that involvement from the benefactors of the research, you know then that the research will go the way it needs to go because you're constantly having the conversations and the dialogues throughout, and all the decision-making is shared. And if you're using mixed methods and you have the qualitative inquiry as a part of your research methodology, then obviously you're going to have the ability to capture the voices of those benefactors in that process. And with that, I've probably gone past my time, but I will yield to my distinguished colleagues, and I'm sure we'll have a few minutes for questions at the end.
Wonderful. Thank you, Dr. Lewis.
Thanks.
Your remarks reminded me of the adage from the disability rights movement of "nothing about us without us."
Absolutely.
So really
Right.
appreciate your remarks and your reflections on the ethics
Right.
that need to guide our research. Dr. Booten Foster.
Hi. Thank you very much, and thank you, Dr. Lewis. Thank you so much for creating this forum for us to come together and to really talk about how do we advance health equity in research. And Dr. Lambert, thank you so much for setting the stage. So I'm an internist, graduated from SUNY Downstate in 1994, and I've been I've been truly blessed to be able to do clinical work. So I've had a private practice, medical education, teaching residents in practice, and research. And much of my career has been in research, and it still is. But my approach to research has really changed, in large measure to just being a Black woman and having life experiences in this body, but also my children. And 2020 did something that really helped to accelerate the focus and really helped me to focus more on health equity. And when I think about health equity in research, I go back to the definition of equity, which is to create opportunities so that everyone can achieve their best, whether it's in education, equity in education, their best level of education. If it's a patient, the best patient care and healthcare outcomes. If it's research, the best to have research outcomes, but also the impact of the research. And so working with colleagues, Dr. Camacho Rivera and Lambert, we've been able to secure funding to help the next generation of researchers to view research through an equity lens. We've been really fortunate. We have the Clinical Research Scholars Training Program funded, NR25 funded by NIMHD. Dr. Daniel Zasaze and I received a HRSA Center of Excellence in Diversity and Equity Research. And we also, Dr. Daniel Zasaze and I, in the School of Public Health, had a HRSA Health Careers Opportunities Grant. So it's really trying to develop the next generation of health equity research. And the frameworks that I've been bringing together to anchor health equity research comes from the literature. So our colleagues, I believe it's Rachel Shelton and Derek Griffin described a health equity framework for implementation scientists. And the three of us really looked at that and have adapted that and modified it to address what we'll plan to do with the COE and CREST. So some of the elements that I believe is important to help anchor research towards equity involves anti-racism, intersectionality, structural competency, trauma-informed, and community, making sure that it's embedded in community. So by anti-racism, it's not just saying we're not racist, therefore all is good, but it's in recognizing what racism does, that it removes opportunity. It creates systems of inferiority, and in medicine, it's been pathologizing the Black body and assigning inferiority to being Black. And we see that in algorithms. Dr. Claire and I just submitted an abstract that looked at how clinical algorithms, EGFR, PFT, VBACs, the spirometry rather, all of those that have race-based coefficients, because it's based on false evidence. It's not scientific, because we know that race is not based on biology, but it's a social construct that's developed, that has been developed. There is no Black gene. And yet, when we do research, when I do research, and I say Blacks are more likely to have, Blacks have worse outcomes because, if I'm not careful in how I frame it to the next generation of researchers, then the focus becomes, well, there must be something with being Black because there's diabetes, there's hypertension. And I think as researchers, we must be scientific in everything that we do. And anti-racism says, recognize that racism exists. It's not that we caused it, but it exists. And we have to, as a scientific community, take a critical look at what we're doing and what we're saying, because our learners will do and say the same thing. So really take this anti-racism framework. The other one is intersectionality. So Dr. Lewis talked about disability community. So intersectionality considers all spheres of identity that cumulatively create opportunities for oppression. And those are some of the things that we do not like to talk about. But as my colleagues who went to the AAMC said, that they're being very explicit in how they talk about equity. So recognizing that different identities will create oppression, whether it's LGBTQI identity, disability, gender-based, immigration status, all of these things together. So if we think of Ms. Lacks being Black, being from a lower socioeconomic strata, being a woman, all of those things combined in some way contribute to how she was treated at Hopkins. And also when we think about Henrietta Lacks, that we have to be careful that we do not assign the pathology of the cells that she had to her race. And to think about all of the things that have happened to her, epigenetic changes that have happened to her cells as a result of the experiences that she had as a woman, as a Black person, as a person from lower socioeconomic backgrounds, right? And all of these intersections create health disparities. Quickly, the other thing is structural competency. So structural competency says, okay, we recognize that racism exists. We recognize that it impacts people at different levels, that COVID did not impact, was not the great equalizer and did not impact everyone the same. So looking at structurally, what are the factors that contribute to poor health outcomes? Trauma-informed says, we do not re-traumatize the communities that we're trying to help through research. We do not create stigma by saying this community is at greater risk for something because they are. It says, what are the structural factors that come together to create these vulnerabilities, right? So when we talk about vulnerable communities and doing research on vulnerable communities, what is it that makes people vulnerable, right? So we say older adults are vulnerable, but how are policies created that create systems that limit independence and thereby making older adults vulnerable? So we really have to be careful with what we say when we're describing the research populations. And last but definitely not least is what Dr. Lewis said, making sure that research is embedded in the community, that research is driven and informed by community priorities, and that research funding is allocated in a way that really supports the community and that the community is not an afterthought. You know, the community is not a subaward as we think about it. So we're doing research on our communities rather than with the communities. And I think as an academic institution, we must lead these difficult discussions. Right? We can't talk about race as the reason for health disparities, because then we just perpetuate this idea of there's something wrong with being Black or Latinx, right? That we really have to think critically about health equities as we do everything else. And it's for the next generation. It's really for our learners. Our students are demanding this. The dean will tell you, our dean will tell you that our students are asking for this. And it's really up to us to take it to, and I'm quoting Dean Brunicardi again, the next level of scientific excellence. That's what equity is. And I'm just truly honored to be here, and I'm looking forward to the talk. And I think I overwent my time. I'm sorry. Thank you.
That's what we do.
Those were some really great comments, and I appreciate Drs. Lewis and Foster sharing their experiences. And so being within public health, I think oftentimes you'll hear a lot of the same sentiments that are echoed with respect to how we prioritize health equity, and some of the considerations with public health are not unique to public health, that we're sharing them with our colleagues in medicine, within health professions, and of course nursing. And so I'd just to reiterate, some of the things that we're actively looking at within public health. Again, recognizing how structural racism and other systems of oppression interact to influence the entire research enterprise, whether that's the representation of investigators and scholars who are conducting research, the funding priorities, whether that's at the federal level, whether it's state level, or we're thinking about private foundations and entities, and the types of questions that we ask and how we go about disseminating those research findings. And so that is something that has been at the forefront of public health, especially within my discipline, trained as a social epidemiologist and health equity researcher. And I want to go back to a point that Dr. Butenfoster just made in recognizing the fact that the purpose of why we're conducting health equity research and spotlighting health equity research is not because health equity research its intention is to produce facts that are going to be remembered. It's because we want to spotlight the conditions that need to be changed. And I think that that's a really important point with respect to the language that we use and the priorities that we set, that if we're not careful when we're conducting health disparities research, that we unintentionally are perpetuating and exacerbating the same misconceptions within communities that we set out to improve. One thing that I also want to just highlight and focus on, and this comes directly, I share the sentiments of Dr. Butenfoster, that I got into the field of public health and academic public health and thinking about its translation because of my lived experiences as a Latina who was born and raised by immigrants from the Dominican Republic and Puerto Rico, and who lived most of her life within one of the most disadvantaged areas of Brooklyn, East New York. And so oftentimes what I would hear within academic settings is I would just hear all of the health disparities, and they would just run off as if they were, again, facts that did not represent the lived experiences and the reality of the communities that were being served within, and the residents within that area. And so oftentimes I always heard what was bad about the community, rather than recognizing that all communities, regardless of their racial, ethnic representation or socioeconomic backgrounds, have assets. And so bringing an assets-based perspective, I think, and not just focusing on, again, deficits was an important area and contribution within public health that I sought to contribute to. And so we were asked to sort of focus on our research areas and then thinking about how we're incorporating health equity in this. So as a social and chronic disease epidemiologist, my work does focus and center structural and social determinants and how structural determinants impact disparities across the chronic disease continuum, with a specific emphasis on cancer and its intersection on other chronic conditions. The second area of research that I highlight is looking at within group heterogeneity. What is masked or what is not explained within these broad racial ethnic categories that we so often use, whether it's Latino, whether it's Black or African American, whether it's Asian or Pacific Islander, whether it's other, and who's considered as part of the other. And of course, thinking about how we translate the scientific evidence, again, into designing, implementing, and evaluating community-engaged interventions through the lens of, again, addressing health equity and health disparities. And so within public health, I want to talk about a few different approaches and how we think about research ethics within each of those approaches. And we talked about the need for mixed method research, and we talked about community-engaged research. And I want to talk a little bit about secondary data analysis and primary data collection, and of course thinking about community-engaged approaches towards program design and interventions. Within secondary data analysis, and I myself as an epidemiologist really lean on many of the data sets that are available, that are collected nationally, whether it's the American Community Survey that's produced by the US Census, whether it's things like the National Health and Nutrition Examination Survey. There's no shortage of sort of publicly available data sets that we oftentimes leverage to be able to describe racial and ethnic and other disparities within the US population. And some of the ethical considerations that I'm very intentional about and bringing up in conversations with fellow colleagues is not taking the data sets for face value, but really sort of taking a step back and understanding who's included and excluded within those particular data sets. Oftentimes, we're very quick to say, strengths of this data set are that this was a nationally representative sample of US adults. That's not true, right? Because many of those particular data sets don't include adults who are institutionalized. It does not include individuals who are incarcerated or interacting with other sections of the criminal legal system. It does not include many individuals who lack legal documentation within the United States, right? And so I think when you're thinking about even something as basic as establishing a prevalence of a specific health condition within the population, recognizing within the denominator and within the numerator who's included and who's excluded and being intentional about that. The other thing that was something that I wanted to point out that, again, that Carla had mentioned was being intentional around the variables and why we're including variables within analyses and data sets. So when you're including race as a covariate within a specific analysis, or whether you're thinking about income or education, linking them back to these broader sort of conceptual frameworks, right? And so thinking about critical race theory, thinking about intersectionality, how can we utilize the variables that exist within these data sets and link them back to the critical theories and understanding what, why, and what is driving these particular relationships that we're studying. And of course, I do want to point out that, again, within many of these data sets and so much of the work that we do, they're driven, and the way that we categorize people, the way that we classify people is really driven by many of the definitions that were used within the government, right? In particular, the way that we categorize race, ethnicity, and how that's considered by the Office of Management and Budget. But recognizing that there are many individuals who are excluded, who are the categorizations and the way that we count people are oftentimes not representative, perhaps, of their lived experiences. And so recognizing, and who's considered, so when race, ethnicity is missing for particular populations, why would that be? When you're excluding populations because you say that there are small sample sizes, right? And you can think about that so much with respect to American Indian, Alaska Native, other indigenous communities, right? So being intentional around utilizing sort of small sample size approaches, thinking about missingness in particular with race, ethnicity, and other sort of social identity characteristics. I want to translate now into talking about primary data collection, because we talked about the importance of mixed method research and conducting both quantitative and qualitative data. And within primary data collection, oftentimes and I'll give an example of my own research within cancer health disparities and cancer health equity research. It's just having this conversation with Dr. Claire, talking about participation or lack of participation of individuals from historically excluded, racial, ethnic, minoritized populations in clinical trials, and how that's a very important limitation for us to really be able to understand cancer health outcomes and advance cancer health equity. And oftentimes we talk about these populations as being hard to reach. That is something that oftentimes you'll hear certainly within public health, you'll hear it in other disciplines. It's not unique, but it's a phrase that's almost become that's become commonplace. And one of the things that, and COVID has taught us this, reinforced this time and time again, is that oftentimes when you think about trust or mistrust within certain communities, we think about that as individual level constructs, as if as participants are the ones who are mistrusting of us, rather than us as academic institutions, healthcare systems, interrogating our own level of trustworthiness and recognizing that trust is a two-way street. So how can we as institutions recognize our historical and current limitations with respect to how we build trust with communities, evaluate our own trustworthiness, and rather than thinking about populations and communities as hard to reach, recognizing that we academic institutions and medical centers and health centers are slow to engage. And so that changes the conversation rather than putting the onus on individuals and participants to the infrastructure, us building the infrastructure and strategies to be able to be quicker to engage and have more sustained engagement. So thinking about strategies around how we recruit, how we eliminate multi-level barriers, institutional barriers around participation, thinking about incentives, and of course, partnerships with community-based organizations around interventions. And so just wanted to conclude again by thinking about the translation into community-engaged interventions from research to action, and recognizing that there are more initiatives that are available that are actually, that are being driven by federal funding agencies, really making sure that there are true community-led partnerships and true community-led interventions. And so again, recognizing that that starts from the research questions that we ask, who we're bringing to the table, how you're establishing who's leading investigations with respect to principal investigators and contact PIs and co-investigators, and recognizing that, again, what it means to be a subcontract versus a primary and having those relationships in power. And then, of course, the importance of thinking about processes to evaluate community partnerships and engagement rather than just thinking about the outcomes with respect to thinking about the health outcomes at the forefront.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Marie-Claire Roberts. I'm an associate dean at the College of Nursing for Scholarship and Evaluation. I'm really pleased to be with you here this morning. I just want to take 2 words from my esteemed colleagues. The challenge of the next generation, and then the bridging of concepts. And in my career, I'm a nurse, 22 years. I began in older adult care and med-surg units, and then moved into the other spectrum, end of the spectrum of age, into the NICU. And as a researcher, I trained as a health services researcher. So again, it's a spectrum, right? Health services research, we look at things at the 50,000-foot level, we look at structures, we look at patient outcomes, and as a nurse, I work individually with that family and that 600-gram baby. So the ethics in this is absolutely throughout within. What I would like to propose today is that in terms of nursing and in terms of the research we do around health equity, that we really need to be bridging between the macro and the micro. As a health services researcher, I began my study and interest in health and bioethics, looking at hospital equity committees in rural communities, and described them and looked at them and what do they do and how do they do it. I also worked with the Global Bioethics Initiative, and we talked about nursing in areas of conflict, huge concepts, massive issues, a lot of concerns. Today, what concerns me and really makes me worried is the nursing workforce. Having been trained in patient outcomes and looking at and having studied what is the contribution of nursing to patient outcomes, I find and am very concerned that we do not have a nursing workforce that can establish the health equity that we need. In order to change the structures that can support sustainable health equity so that every single patient and person that accesses our healthcare system receives safe, quality, equitable care, we need to look at our workforce, the micro. Everything we say to each other as professionals and providers, and everything we say and do to our patients will either undermine or change the system that we have. In the nursing workforce, in academia, the average age of a professor is between 55 and 65, and we are predominantly white women. We know from research that our students who are from African American descent, Latinx, disproportionately fall out of our programs, up to 50% more likely to leave nursing programs, not finish nursing programs. So how can we create a pipeline to a diverse workforce to support and sustain health equity if we can't even get our nursing students into the field? And once they are in the field, in nursing, something we never talk about is the uncivil, bullying environment that we work in, that we have created. It's inhospitable to a diverse workforce. If we do not change that, if we do not research why are we here and what is sustaining that uncivil environment, we cannot sustain change in terms of health equity on the macro level. It starts with each and every one of us. And the research has to start with each and every one of us. Thank you.
What an incredible set of reflections and an opportunity for shared learning. So I just want to thank each of the panelists again for your introductory remarks. I do want to ask the question, you know, as I was listening, I was thinking that the call to action that we've heard here is not only to galvanize the way that we train the next generation of researchers to advance health equity, but it also requires that prepare, conduct, disseminate that research in a conscionable and with ethics at the core of what we do, and that we also then think about the partnerships institutionally in terms of the academic community partnerships that can sustain and facilitate that this work as we move forward. And I would like to ask each of you just about, in any of those dimensions or others, just resources or recommendations for how we can continue to do this work here at Downstate with some of the most cutting edge, exciting innovations or solid foundations that you can think of to advance health equity in the research that we do.
You want us to go in order?
Just anyone feel free
Okay.
to respond. Dr.
So
Lewis.
I'll jump in. One of the concepts in the disability world that's very important is a concept called knowledge translation, and it's similar to bench to bedside in translational research. Knowledge translation comes out of the Canadian Institutes of Health, and the concept really speaks to adding an additional responsibility to researchers. You know, so researchers tend to conduct the research, and then they disseminate it, and they think they're done. And we know from research by persons like Hennessy that sometimes there's a huge gap between when we know something based on research and when that knowledge gets integrated as evidence-based everyday practice in a field. It can be a decade gap between knowing the information, having the knowledge, and it being everyday evidence-based practice in the field. So knowledge translation is designed to narrow that time frame. So one of the things that knowledge translation says is that a researcher not only has to conduct the research and disseminate it, but at the end of the process, that's when their work begins. So they have to measure the dissemination, the extent to which that dissemination hits the target groups, whether or not those target groups, if it's clinicians, they have any intentionality of using the research, and whether they actually do use the research, and whether that knowledge, well, not the research, but the knowledge that they've used has had an impact on the clinical populations. So I think if we can get researchers, I know it's a tall order because it certainly increases the lift of a researcher, but knowledge translation says that the researcher has that responsibility to really ensure that the knowledge does get implemented in everyday practice. So that's a concept I think is important in ensuring that health and disability equity really does happen. That kind of research really does happen in a way that is right and ethical and moral and kind of gets to the right things. And in terms of what I would suggest, are we asking about resources now, Dr. Mackey?
Yeah.
2 resources I would suggest, and I brought one with me. One is you may be familiar with Edwin Nichols, psychologist who his work is called The Philosophical Aspects of Cultural Difference. And what he talks about is, they call it the philosophical aspects. He talks about a whole bunch of them, but the main ones are axology, that which has value, epistemology, how we come to know things, the methodology around conducting research or disciplinary inquiry, pedagogy, how we teach, and logic, how we reason and arrive at conclusions. His work, 1989, anybody who's curious. And what he says is that worldview impacts those philosophical processes. There is no one best approach. That worldview and culture impacts how we approach those philosophical processes. So I would encourage researchers who are trying to do health equity research to be familiar with his work, because you have to understand that the methodologies we're using in research in the Western world may not be, that's how we're trained, those of us in this room and in this university, but that's not necessarily the only way to come to know things. So there's variation on that, and there's no one best way to do that. Edwin Nichols, 1989, Philosophical Aspects of Disability. And this book, I would suggest, it's called Race, Culture, and Disability, Rehab Science and Practice. And it was done in, I have to remember when it was, 2010 was when it was published. And so it's old now, right? But it's a great book. It's got 4 sections, and the first 2 sections really look at the intersection of race and culture and other cultural factors and discipline inquiry. So there are chapters that deal with those issues, and then the final 2 sections deal with primarily clinical practice. This is a great book. I was involved with it. It was produced by some editors out of the University of Illinois at Chicago, and they had basically a national blue ribbon group of authors who contributed. I actually have a chapter in here. It's a clinical tool that I developed. But this would be a great, particularly if you're interested in disability as it relates to health equity, a great book to have. And actually, I have an extra copy, so I'm happy to give a copy to anybody who has that interest. So I'll stop there.
Thank you very much. And Dr. Lewis is being very modest because he's published several books in a short span that I've known you for about 6 years.
No.
I think he has a book. I have 3 books from you.
No.
Like a book a year.
No, not books. Just chapters.
Not a book a year, right? I'm sorry. Every other year.
Well, I didn't publish this book. I just have a chapter in the book.
This
is not my
several
book.
books.
But this is a great one, yeah.
So in terms of resources, to continue this theme of books, one of the things that I did in the midst of the pandemic is read a lot of audiobooks because of public transportation was inconsistent and unreliable during that time. I just started reading audiobooks. So Immortal Life of Henrietta Lacks, of course, I think it's a very important book to read, and for us to ask ourselves what happened and why it happened. Another book that I read was The Color of Law, and it's by Rothstein. And we actually had an opportunity to bring, to hear at SUNY Downstate, Dr. Salafu and the Brooklyn Health Disparity Center. And in this book, Mr. Rothstein really connects structural racism to social determinants by taking a very in-depth look at redlining and why communities are the way they are, and how this was a policy, an accepted policy of residential segregation, and how that ties to wealth and generational wealth and opportunities and equity. So it's an excellent book. And so I would say the resources that exist for us as of equity-focused researchers may not necessarily may not be found in some of the traditional texts that we read, that we really have to look at our social scientists and historians and political writings to learn from those resources. So there's a ton of books that are out there. The AAMC also has a list of recommended reading. So I would recommend that. The other resource is going to community-based organization meetings, not to do research, but to be a part of the advisory board. So Dr. Nuere and I are part of Independent Care Services, ICS.
Right,
ICS.
right.
And it's being, or another group that the students and I are a part of, the New York Lawyers for Public Interest. They have a medical access roundtable. And we're there, we were invited because of our interest in research and education, but when we're there, we're community members. It's not our meeting, so we do not set the agenda. And oftentimes we'll have meetings and we say, oh, well, let's invite the community. But we set the agenda. We set the agenda and the priorities. So being a part of a meeting, I just go there as Carla. And I listen and learn. So I think another resource is, and there's so many community boards around SUNY Downstate. There's so many meetings that are open to the public, and it would be important as researchers and for our students just to go to a meeting and hear how people talk, hear about their experiences before they become patients, because the experiences that they have and how someone presents as a patient may be totally different or not. So I would recommend reading books that are outside of the traditional medical or strictly public health or scientific genres, but looking at books, more social science books, and just going out there to the community. Listen to Uber drivers as they talk about their families, and they were once doctors and pharmacists and nurses in their own country. So there's a tremendous resource just by being around and really tapping into really having all senses and antennas up when you're in the midst of community, because there's just so much to learn.
I think two sort of additional resources that I might add, and again, I'm thinking about, I guess, more short-term ways to be able to sort of integrate or bring up opportunities for dialogue and discussion, especially amongst our students within the courses that we teach and just in conversations. And so there has been some really, again, phenomenal work that Dr. Foster mentioned, a work of our colleague and who is a consultant with us on CREST, Dr. Derek Griffith, who runs the Center for Racial Justice and Men's Health at Georgetown, doing some really great work, again, around moving beyond just sort of individual level trust and mistrust in terms of thinking about trustworthiness of healthcare organizations. So how do we go about assessing our own institutional trustworthiness and barriers that we impose to establishing trust within communities? And so there was a 2022 article that was published in Milbank Quarterly that looked at how we go about measuring trustworthiness in healthcare organizations. That was senior authored by Dr. Griffith, and some other work in the Annals of Internal Medicine about barriers towards establishing trustworthiness of academic medical centers and how that influences participation of racial ethnic minorities in research. And then specifically within my area and focusing on Latino health equity research, what you'll find is that there's no shortage of examples, unfortunately, of real atrocities and injustices that were committed by academic institutions in the name of research. And so one that I often point to, especially relevant in my work in advancing cancer health equity research among Latina women, is a documentary that was released in 1982 called La Operación, which documents the U.S. imposed sterilization processes among Puerto Rican women and the mass sterilization that occurred between the 1950s and 1960s, but really dates back to 1930s, and establishes that by 1956, one out of 3 Puerto Rican women had been sterilized without their informed consent. And so, and then just following up on that, the Puerto Rican pill trials documentary, which again documents experimentation of the first birth control pills before they were approved within the United States, again among Puerto Rican women. And so very relevant to the work that I'm doing with respect to advancing Latino cancer disparities. And there's and again, just kind of bringing that dialogue across different examples and into more contemporary spaces.
I would like to offer as resources, first and foremost, ourselves and our patients who we serve and the community that we serve. I would love to see emulated the NICE model from the UK, where every single trial study that is designed involves in those initial design phases the patient, the population, the community that is to be studied. And I think if we emulate that and invite people into our world, we will close that chasm that currently exists between academia and the practice setting, between academia and the communities that we serve and want to work for. I'd like to also offer the various global bioethics institutes and foundations who do incredible work worldwide. The UN has phenomenal resources in terms of how do we define terms. You talked about the covariate of race. What does that mean? What do we use? How do we use it? Where do we use it? The perspectives globally are very different from what we see here in the US, and I think if we kind of broaden our horizon, that would be extremely useful. That's it. Thank you.
Wonderful. So I'll just ask for concluding remarks from our panel. Just any last thoughts or reflections that you might each have, and just perhaps conclude with by myself saying, you know, I think here we have on great display how we can achieve our shared goal of being a community of learning that seeks to advance health equity, right? I've learned so much, and having the opportunity to hear from each of you and hear about your orientation to thinking through the research ethics that need to guide our work if we're going to advance health equity through partnership, through self-reflexivity, through training, and beyond. So, Dr. Lewis, perhaps I'll ask that we go down the line again. And
sure, absolutely. There is one other resource that, since we talked a little bit about community work and looking at communities from an assets perspective, I think a couple of my colleagues, there's a work that, all the stuff I cite is old because I'm old. But there's a book called Building Communities from the Inside Out by Kretzmann and McKnight. And I think the date is 1987. They're really, if you're interested in looking at communities and learning how to understand the assets assessment process, an assets assessment is the inverse of needs assessment. Assets, glasses half full; needs, glass half empty. So we always want to build on strengths, and so that's what it's all about. In terms of concluding remarks, health and disability equity, doing that kind of work, as I tell folks all the time, none of us are experts. Sometimes faculty get offended when you say that, but I have no problem saying you're not an expert. You're just an advanced learner. Because in my mind, I define an expert as somebody who can, no matter what question you ask them in their field, they can answer it. And I don't know anybody who can answer every question that can be posed to them in their field. That's my definition of an expert, if you can answer all the questions. So we're advanced learners, and I think we should embrace what I call the lifelong learning, continuous quality improvement process as we embark on health equity research. It doesn't matter where we start. You start from where you are today. But the idea is that tomorrow you know a little more about it and you do a little bit better in terms of how you're approaching it. And the next day, even better. And the day after that, even better. So the idea is, let's start where we are. Let's commit to being lifelong learners and engage in a continuous quality improvement process, collaborating with each other, learning from each other going forward. And then I think we'll get close to where we need to be. As Dr. Raleigh says, our esteemed president, we're not looking for perfection, we're looking for quality and quality improvement.
Well, again, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I was truly fortunate to have known and worked with and partnered with Dr. Powderly. And what I admired about her was that she was intentional about what she wanted to do with the program. At times she faced opposition, but being intentional about what we do and where we are. Dr. Powderly was always aware of where we are in the community and in our surrounding community, and recognizing the strength in our community. So it goes back to the asset that we have in this community at SUNY Downstate. And Dr. Lambert and I just had this conversation about we are uniquely positioned to change how health equity research is conducted, the ethics of research. as much as I love my colleagues at my other institutions, they aspire, no, really, they aspire to do what we do by going into communities that have been marginalized and minoritized. And yet we find ourselves here. And the ability to really recognize the strength that's in the community and not a pit of problems, but possibilities. This is not a problematic community. This is a community with so much possibilities. Who they've when we're all no longer here at Downstate, our community will be there. Their children will still be here. And being intentional and honest with how we have relationships with our community is really important to developing that trust. So, when I tell our students why should I come to Downstate? And I said, if you want to make change, be impactful. If you want to work within a community of like-minded individuals, faculty, where it's the power of culture and diversity is palpable. Like it's right, and I mentioned this to Dr. Lambert, Dr. Christini when they were coming here, and they're like, why should I leave and come here? And I said, when you come here, you'll feel it. And right. I said, yeah, we're not perfect, but when you come here, there is something about this institution, and I just want us to remember that as challenging as it may be sometimes, that there's something about this institution. And there's so much that we can do. There's so many possibilities. So thanks to Dr. Powderly and the Connolly Foundation and Dr. Mackey for really creating this forum.
I wholeheartedly agree. I think that, we oftentimes, when you think about excellence and whether it's academic excellence, training excellence, research excellence, clinical excellence, so often you hear other institutions saying, oh, we are an institution of academic excellence or research excellence, and we're diverse. Or as if diversity is not something that's central to being an institution of excellence, that equity is not something that's central to being an institution of excellence. I think that we at Downstate recognize that you cannot be an institution that claims excellence in training the next generation of health professionals, in advancing research, in advancing research in transformative sort of clinical practice and translating that into action, if you do not have diversity, equity, and inclusion at the center of all of your different, at the center of your values and how you translate that into action. And so I think that, recognizing that we have the advantage where we know that, we see that, and how we continue to sort of institutionalize that, how we can reflect on that and make sure that that's something that's that's something that's explicit within our policies and our practices.
How can I follow that? Probably just to say, I think that this and these kind of opportunities is where it's at. As has been said many times today, it's about the reflection, it's about being very purposeful, and it's about thinking about the future and how we move forward.
And so with that, we will conclude this panel, but I do just once again want to thank our panelists. We can see the expertise that we have here at Downstate and the really the deeply reflectful and insightful comments that you each provided to us. So there's one last round of applause for our panel. Thank you.
We're learning.
Next on our agenda, I have the opportunity to introduce, but also to welcome one of our newest faculty members. We've been so fortunate to be able to recruit Dr. Roseanne Peterson, who is a visiting associate professor of psychiatry, director of training and research ethics and scientific integrity, and the POP, GEM lab director in population genetics and environment and in mental health, Dr. Roseanne Peterson, who will now give our keynote address entitled Missing Diversity in Human Genetic Studies Limits Precision Medicine.
Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Lazar, for the invitation to speak today. As Dr. Cristini mentioned, I am new faculty here at SUNY Downstate in the Department of Psychiatry, and I'm a trained statistical geneticist, and I'll be talking to you today about both the scientific and ethical implications of the missing diversity in our genetic studies. Okay, so on the agenda today, first I'll cover the current state of the field of our genetic studies and show the current representation in these genetic studies. I'll then highlight 2 examples of ethical implications using polygenic risk scoring and polygenic embryo screening, and then I'll end with some recommendations to the field and future directions of research that's happening here at Downstate. So here's my disclosure slide. No conflicts of interest to report, but this work was supported by the NIMH and as well as the Brain and Behavior Research Foundation, and I'd like to thank them for their support. Okay, it is truly an exciting time to be involved in genetics. Because of advances in technology and statistical methods, we have identified thousands of genetic variants associated with disease. And in this cartoon here, represents the progress that we have made. It shows our 22 chromosomes from chromosome 1 through 22, X and Y, and all these different colored dots represent the thousands of genetic variants that have been identified to be associated with diseases, disorders, or medical traits. And really, translational medicine will use these genomic hits for drug discoveries, to develop therapeutic targets, to identify points for intervention and risk prediction, with really the ultimate goal of improving precision medicine. So what is a genome-wide association study? Basically, we collect cases and controls and genotype genetic variants across the genome. And through regression, we identify genetic variants that are associated with a trait or disorder, basically variants with higher frequency in cases than in the control group. So down here is what we call a Manhattan plot, which shows the association of each genetic variant. That's each dot here. And each color on the x-axis represents chromosome 1 through 22. And the y-axis here, we have the p-value of the association, or the significance value of the genetic variant and the trait. And those that are above this significance threshold are statistically significant given multiple testing. Okay, so we have identified thousands of genetic variants associated with disease and disorders from these genome-wide association studies. But I'd like to temper this enthusiasm as we have a serious representation problem. To date, our genome-wide association studies have focused primarily on populations of European descent, with the estimates indicating that 78%, that is a disproportionate majority of our participants in published genome-wide association studies, are of European descent. So our genetic studies are not reflective of global diversity. So in my field, how are we doing in psychiatric genetics? And this box here on the right represents the proportion of major global continental populations in the world: European, East Asian, South Asian, Middle Eastern, African, Hispanic, Oceanic. And these boxes over here on the left show our representation in our studies of psychiatric disorders. We have major depression, schizophrenia, PTSD, bipolar disorder, ADHD, autism spectrum disorders, alcohol dependence, and anorexia nervosa. What do you see? Lots of blue. Studies of our major psychiatric disorders are really no exception, right? Having focused largely on European ancestry populations. Okay, so now that you've had a chance to hear about the current state of the representation in the field, I'd like to discuss 2 examples to highlight why this is highly problematic. And first up, I'll discuss some implications for polygenic risk scoring. Okay, so what is a polygenic risk score? It's basically an aggregate measure of an individual's genetic risk for a trait. So what we're doing is we're adding up all the risk variants across the genome and weighting them by their effect size into a score. And if you plot these scores in the population, those with more risk variants tend to be more likely to have the disorder than those with less genetic risk variants. Okay, so now we looked at the association of polygenic risk scores across traits and populations. And this figure is showing data that we extracted from 733 polygenic scoring studies and looking at the ancestry representation across the past 10 years. And again, as you can see in blue, they were primarily in European ancestry. Okay, this is highly problematic for transferability and generalizability of results. These risk scores are performing 3 times better in European ancestry individuals than in African ancestry individuals, right? So these polygenic risk scores have reduced prediction accuracy when used across ancestries. So as these scores become incorporated into clinical medicine, this lack of generalizability will really limit our precision medicine and health equity. Okay, there are many benefits for the inclusion of diverse participants in genetic research. Increased power for locus discovery. The resolution of causal variant phi mapping can be improved through cross-ancestry analyses. Basically, we're leveraging the small differences in correlation between individuals to get closer to the true causal genetic variant. Constructing polygenic scores from cross-ancestry and meta-analyses results have been shown to improve prediction overall. It improves for prediction in everyone. And understanding how genetic risk and social inequities interact to influence disparities in disease risk and outcomes will be really critical to improving our public health. A lack of diversity will limit the utility of precision medicine efforts, and as well as pharmacogenetics. So just let me explain. Some therapeutics may be more effective or safer in certain populations because of ancestry-specific differences in the frequency of variants that are associated with drug metabolism. So really, in order to maximize the potential benefits of genetic research for public health, it is truly essential that diverse populations are better represented in our ongoing and future initiatives. Okay, so the next example, I'd like to discuss the use of polygenic risk scores for embryo screening of common complex diseases. But first, I'd like to give a little bit of background on pre-implantation embryo screening. So this piece isn't really new, right? So for the past 30 years, we have done pre-implantation genetic testing as part of the process for in vitro fertilization, IVF. And looking at the purple circle here, we've done pre-implantation genetic screening to ensure that there are 23 pairs of chromosomes and that there is no aneuploidy, right? There's no extra chromosomes or missing chromosomes. Additionally, we've also done pre-implantation genetic diagnoses. This is the right side of the pink circle here, to detect known genetic disorders that are caused by a known single gene, right? Like cystic fibrosis. And in general, the process takes a small piece of the embryo to be biopsied, then it's screened for chromosome abnormalities and severe genetic disorders. Then it's only those unaffected embryos that are selected for implantation to really prevent known serious disorders of a known cause. Okay, now for polygenic embryo screening. Because of the rapidly advancing scale of genome-wide association studies, coupled with the ability to really generate accurate genome-wide genotypes from single-cell input, has made it possible to screen embryos for risk of common complex traits, including psychiatric disorders and other polygenic traits like height or cognitive ability. So polygenic embryo screening is a new technique in which each embryo that's derived from that cycle of IVF is densely genotyped, and the genotype data are then used to generate the polygenic risk scores to estimate risk of a disease or the potential phenotypic value of a quantitative trait for each embryo. Then the prospective parent can then select which embryo or embryos to implant based on these polygenic risk scores. Okay, although there is little empirical research concerning the potential risks or the benefits of polygenic embryo screening for psychiatric or really any other disorder, this service is already commercially available. This is not science fiction. There are multiple direct-to-consumer companies that will screen embryos based on polygenic risk scores, including for psychiatric traits. Here's another company, an example of results for one embryo of their calculated risk based on polygenic risk scores. You can see diabetes in this list, schizophrenia, and even heart attack. So in response to this, we, the International Society of Psychiatric Genetics, published an ethics statements on the advisory on the use of polygenic risk scores to screen embryos for adult mental health conditions. And we stated that our society views with concern the offering of polygenic embryo screening services for psychiatric conditions for both scientific and ethical reasons. And we really urge caution and calls for additional research and oversight on the use of polygenic embryo screening. We subsequently wrote this viewpoint about the concerns about the use of polygenic embryo screening for psychiatric and cognitive traits, and I'd just like to highlight some of these concerns. First, polygenic risk scores do not determine whether a person will develop a condition, right? We know that common complex diseases like diabetes, like schizophrenia, are the result of genes and important environmental risk factors, right? Genetic variants that comprise these polygenic risk scores have very small effect sizes, and even in aggregate only account for a portion of the liability. For example, major depression, this is just 8% of the liability. And also, as seen on this figure here, many individuals in gray here, which have elevated scores, elevated polygenic risk scores, are actually phenotypically healthy. So again, to reiterate, these polygenic risk scores are not deterministic. Okay, second, polygenic risk scores are not specific to a single condition. This means that selection for one condition can affect other genetic traits. Remember this figure of our GWAS hits on the 22 chromosomes here? We see several different phenotypes being associated at the same locus, okay? This is called pleiotropy. And an example of this is that risk for some psychiatric traits are correlated genetically with positively regarded traits such as educational attainment or creativity. So when we are selecting against one trait, we are also selecting against other traits in many unknown ways as well. Okay, third, it's not known how to accurately communicate this level of risk to prospective parents, right? It's important that parents understand the actual risks, right? This is in contrast to pre-implantation screening, where we have a single gene of a known cause, right? Variants in these polygenic risk scores are not deterministic. It's not certain that the child will have the disorder. And fourth, in many countries, there's no regulation or oversight of polygenic embryo screening to protect against misuse, like there are for other kinds of genetic testing. And fifth, screening embryos for psychiatric and other common conditions may increase stigma surrounding these diagnoses. And finally, genetics has a history of misuse for eugenics, and polygenic embryo screening really raises many ethical, legal, and social issues that can potentially lead to harm and have not yet been really fully studied or addressed, including participants, right, in these large genome-wide association studies that contribute their data to research may certainly not want their data used in this way to screen embryos. And then to tie in the first part of the talk on the lack of diversity of ancestry representation in our genetic studies, selecting on these polygenic risk scores, which have been trained on majority European ancestry, will have significantly reduced performance across ancestries. And so we can kind of argue, what are we really selecting for with polygenic embryo screening? Perhaps an unintended effect could be selecting for European ancestry, right? The research is just not there. Okay, while genetics research is improving our understanding of the biological underpinnings of disease, neurodiversity, and health, using genetics in ways that maximize benefits and minimize harms to individuals and society really depends largely on how these ethical, legal, and social implications of our genetic results are managed, which is why symposiums like this are so important to really raise awareness and have these conversations. Okay, finally, I'd like to end with highlighting some of the barriers to progress for inclusive genetic studies and some of the future research directions that we're doing here at SUNY Downstate. Okay, from researchers, one barrier to inclusion of diverse ancestries in genetic studies is not knowing the appropriate methods to robustly analyze the data. And so a guide to help researchers did not exist, so we made one. So we published a best practices primer for genetic studies in ancestrally diverse populations. Again, a major concern when analyzing these data from diverse and admixed ancestries is false associations due to population stratification, right? We want to distinguish true signals from just statistical artifacts. And in this primer, we provide an analytic plan with extensive quality control steps to minimize this inflation due to population stratification while maximizing sample retention, maximizing inclusivity and power. So we also provide recommendations to the field to facilitate inclusive genetic research. We need to utilize all the existing data. We need to stop excluding samples because the group is too small. And we need to invest in large-scale studies of diverse populations as well as open science and collaboration. We need to engage in community-based participatory research. Invest in global capacity building with targeted delivery of skills and training, empower scientists from underrepresented groups. We need to call on our scientific journal editors and us, the article reviewers, to make sure that all the data is being analyzed, not just those of European ancestry, as well as funding agencies to make sure that the research that is being funded has a plan for inclusion. Okay, I'll touch quickly on another initiative. In order to advance health equity in psychiatric genetics, we started the PsychEmerge Diversity Initiative. We've drafted an R01 to support this work. It is currently in process. This is a dedicated initiative within the PsychEmerge network. And PsychEmerge is a network of electronic health record-linked biobanks across the U.S. And the goal here is to really leverage EHR biobanks, which are collected in real-world clinical settings, which makes them particularly valuable for research at reflecting population diversity. So here we formed the PsychEmerge Diversity Initiative, which is a dedicated effort to increase representation in our genetic studies of psychiatric disorders, schizophrenia, bipolar, and major depression, which currently consists of 7 sites, including Downstate, myself from the Department of Psychiatry, and Dr. Azir Thompson from Public Health. And other sites include Mount Sinai, Vanderbilt, Geisinger, Mass Gen, U.S. Veterans, as well as Penn Medicine Biobank. Okay, why do we need a diversity initiative? As you saw in that earlier slide, a disproportionate majority of participants in our genetic studies are of European descent, and we must do better. So here's our collaborative model. In AIM 1, we will develop and validate psychiatric phenotypic algorithms. And AIM 2, we'll perform trans ancestry genetic studies for improved transferability and generalizability and performance of these polygenic risk scores so that we can reach equity and association across populations. And I'd also like to point out, in addition to an advisory committee, we also have another important feature of this initiative is that we have an ethical considerations and research committee. And this committee will facilitate a bias mitigation plan, which will be recommendations by external bioethics experts. And this plan will use resources at each of the 7 sites to identify potential weaknesses in study design or interpretations of findings that may be related to unconscious biases or missing perspectives. Okay, so here are the sample sizes for each site by EHR reported race and ethnicity. We have about 1.5 million individuals in total. About 1 million are white non-Hispanic, 200,000 black non-Hispanic, and close to 50,000 white Hispanic. Okay, so here, this figure, once again, one last time, the top panel here shows the general representation of the world and the US. And the left panel is where we are today in our representation of our genetic studies of schizophrenia, bipolar disorder, and major depression. And the right panel here is where we will be after we have included data from the PsychEmerge Diversity Initiative. So you can see that these samples are adding up. While we still have a ways to go to reach sample size parity, we can make a difference. So I'll end here. This is my lab website. If you're interested in this type of work, please reach out. Would love to collaborate. Also, we're hiring postdocs, a research coordinator, a data manager. There's a link on the website to contact us. And with that, I thank you for your attention, and I think we have 5 or 10 minutes to have a discussion.
Are there any questions for Dr. Peterson? Please come up and take the mic.
Dr. Peterson, thanks so much. Great talk. With regard to the PsychEmerge study and getting downstate involved, have you run into challenges here with integrating with our hospital and our electronic health record? I know that's a challenge for us as an institution, and I'm wondering if it's been an impediment or it's something that you are starting to be able to work through.
So I just got here August 2nd, so we haven't actually got that far yet.
Well, if you do,
and the grants are still being transferred.
By chance, if you do, you know where to find us. We're trying to work on that together with the hospital in our office.
Great.
What type of samples are you currently collecting for the biobank?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
What type of samples are you collecting for the biobank?
Okay, so from PsychEmerge, this is biobanks from across the U.S., and so it's basically electronic health records. So it's all electronic health records, and then it's lab values, and then if there's extra blood, there's consent. If there's extra blood taken, that's how we do the genotyping.
Okay, so I'm just thinking that in terms of downstate, where we serve over 87% of skin of color population, how can we best contribute to the biobank? What type of samples would be welcome for the biobank?
I'd say blood is the best, but we can do cheek swabs too if there's an aversion to did blood collection.
Thank you.
Is anyone here from the biobank that could address that a bit more? Okay.
Okay, thank you. Dr. Peterson, thank you very much. For your psych Merge Diversity Initiative, are you looking for additional collaborators here downstate?
Absolutely.
Okay, because we have,
Absolutely.
in the School of Health Professions, that's good to hear, we have a health informatics group that might be very helpful in terms of some of the things you're doing with that initiative. So I'll make sure I put them in contact with you.
Great, fantastic.
Great, thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Welcome to Downstate for your presentation. Sorry I missed some of it. I had
Thank you.
to take care of a clinical issue. Just a question regarding to Dr. Camacho Rivera's point that I learned today. I also knew it before. How do you account for the subgroups? For example, in the Hispanic category, there's several subgroups, just like there is in Black, African. So just how can you account for that in the work that you're doing? How do you attempt to attain that information?
Right. Okay. So there's sort of two approaches to analyzing diverse ancestry data. One is a stratified meta-analysis, and the other is trans ancestry method through mixed models, where you're not doing any stratifying. And so I also probably should take this time to say that race and ethnicity is not ancestry, right? So you kind of notice, for the most part, I've avoided talking about race and ethnicity when we're talking about genetic models and polygenic risk scoring. What we've done for this stratified approach is we use reference panels. This is data collected from around the world. Using genetic data, we assign each individual in the data set to their closest ancestry group, right? And so ancestry groups don't match on to racial ethnicity groups. So it's so basically we're using an empirical sort of stratification, and this is not for any social determinants of health. This is purely to avoid that issue I talked about, population stratification. We don't want to have spurious genetic associations that are just due to random drift in the genome. Yes.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. A comment and a question. The comment is regarding the biobank. I don't believe that there's a systematic effort to take all comers. You know, for instance, like the Mount Sinai's BioMe initiative.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I think part of that is going to have to be built on trust and some perceived benefit to the community, and making
Right.
sure that what the biobank is doing is aligned with the community needs assessment. That said, there have been kind of targeted initiatives for COVID, and within particular clinics like in cardiology, and there's very nice space and resources and interest in doing that. We do. Ought to prioritize that. My question for you is, so I'll get asked, sorry?
Yeah,
Oh.
it's a little hard to hear.
I'll get
up
asked
here.
sometimes by our colleagues, there's your genetic code, but what about your zip code? So could you comment on the relevance of environment here? And as an example, I mean, access to healthcare, is one example. We might typically think of, food insecurity or trauma, right? But when you can go to a doctor, when during your illness you go to a doctor, how does that shape our perception of things?
Right. So I'd say a major criticism of genetic research to date is they've largely left out environmental risk factors in the modeling. And part of another grant that we're working on for my PopGem lab is genes and environment for major depression. And so this is another reason why this polygenic embryo screening is very controversial, right? So we know these complex traits that they're doing, these polygenic risk scores for the polygenic embryo screening have almost as equal part genetic as environment, right? So these environmental impacts are extremely important and need to be better included in the models.
Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Really appreciate the opportunity.
Thank you, Dr. Peterson. Next, we have a series of presentations by our Connolly Scholars. Connolly Scholars are our very own students that have taken advanced training and have shown interest in the field of bioethics, much of which has related to clinical but also to research ethics. So it's a pleasure to call upon Dr. Christopher Roman, Interim Chair of the Department of Cellular Biology, Associate Professor of Department of Medicine. Dr. Roman is our Unit 3 Director and has all kinds of other responsibilities, including co-director of our very successful Bridges to Medicine program, and holds positions in the College of Medicine and the School of Graduate Studies. So, Dr. Roman.
Thank you very much. Well, I guess thank you very much, everybody, the organizers, our leadership, for thinking that this symposium and this topic matters. I'm still processing the excitement and the promise that I heard from our newest and esteemed and brilliant colleagues. I think Dr. Powderly would be standing up and cheering. I think she is. To hear the enthusiasm, the focus, and the brilliant expertise by thought leaders that we have here on campus who recognize and can really capitalize on the possibilities, what we can do to move the needle forward to greater health equity. It's the other thing I think that's really critical to appreciate, which we all understand already, is that this is not an abstraction. This is not some scholarly project. This is deeply personal. And Dr. Powderly recognized that. The other thing that she recognized, which you all did, which also she would be, I think, the most grateful for, is that you recognize how this impacts the next generation, our learners, our junior colleagues who are trusting us to be guides and ambassadors into these healing professions and research science. And that's really where I guess what I'm going to present to you really fits in. I was entrusted by the Connolly Scholars to present their perspectives. It was a little, you can imagine, the scholars really represent campus leaders, our leaders, future leaders, advocates, equity champions. And so they got busy lives. Some are doing postdocs, going to meetings, they're all across the country. They're taking care of sick babies in the ICU who have RSV. So you can imagine what this is like. And so what I've tried to do is put together a representation, a snapshot of the students that I interacted with the most. I was most involved with the Connolly division and Dr. Powderly probably about 4 or 5 years ago, I'd say. And, when Dr. Buden-Foster said commented, like, Dr. Powderly was, Kathy, we all called her, including her students, was intentional. She intentionally recognized opportunities to put people together, to bring people together who never would have had another opportunity to interact, but she knew who had some deep investment in diversity, equity, inclusion, justice, and she made it happen. And so I first met her when we both served, well, we were both in governance for many years. I knew her through that venue, but also more formally when we were serving on the Conflict of Interest Committee several years ago. And it was just sort of, we got to know each other better. And one day she said, oh, we're having a seminar on conflict of interest through the Connolly. We're going to dinner afterwards. Do you want to come? Sure, that sounds fun. Little did I know what a journey that would be and what a deeply profound and transformative process it was for my scholarship and for my person, for my spirit, to be included in those spaces with the scholars. So that's a little bit of what I'm going to be talking about in the few minutes that I have. Okay, so this was probably one of the most magnificent experiences I've had with the Connolly division. This was a photograph that was taken at the Frida Kahlo exhibit when was it? I guess it was 2019. And what Dr. Powderly knew, she recognized an opportunity to bring students together, not just medical students, not just graduate students, but from all the colleges and schools at the time, to come together to experience this exhibit, because she knew Frida Kahlo's story. She knew that Frida Kahlo was a passionate, brilliant artist who, in her art, explored identity or identities and intersectionalities, who experienced profound pain and disability and reproductive challenges to her reproductive health that she expressed through her art. You may know that her body casts are part of that she used as objects of expression. And so she wanted the students to see all that and talk about it. And having gone there, and you could see the smiles on everybody's faces. They were so excited. Students were running around with their sketchbooks, talking to each other. They had no idea how meaningful it would be to their experience. But Kathy knew that this was an opportunity to bring all of these students together so they can have a shared experience, talk about it, and maybe continue the conversation. Next time they run into each other, they'll call each other up. Wow, I didn't know you were in the School of Public Health. I didn't know you were in SOAP. Let's change numbers. One of the experiences that she created for the students through the Connolly, and not just, and all of our trainees, because she did this for residents as well, was to organize visits to the Brooklyn Museum in which groups of 20, 25 students or residents would come together to ponder an object that was selected by one of the curators who's in the middle in the back, that's Monica Marino, who was the director of adult education at the time. And so they would get together outside of campus as people in the community, right, as peers, colleagues, again, in the shared experience environment, to talk about things that we all teach, we want to cultivate in our students. When we think about the powers of observation, right? When we think about, what assumptions we have or biases when we're taking in information. How do we communicate about that? How do we feel about that? These are the forums in which those types of conversations would take place. So on the left is an example of one of the art pieces that Monica Marino had chosen. And she would intentionally position some of the audience members or the participants so they would have sort of obscured or skewed views. And sometimes the art was not that abstract, it was more literal and representational. And she'd ask people, what do you think is going on? How do you feel about what's going on? And what she thoughtfully did was to use these opportunities to have students have a safe space to explore discomfort. When you don't know everything, when you don't know all the answers, how is your mind filling in the blanks to try to make sense of situations that you have to respond to? That's what our trainees have to do all the time, especially when they go into clinical settings. They're always walking through these liminal spaces, right? These in-between moments where realities shift and you have to be prepared for the unexpected and just go in with whatever you have and see how it goes. And that's the type of discussions that would be possible because of an experience like that. Another opportunity that Dr. Powderly created for the scholars and other interested students was to learn more about bioethics and humanities, right? That's a very important word for what she did and what the society promotes, because as you know, healthcare is storytelling. Healthcare is based on observation. And many of our students have those skills. They walked into the door, history majors, or journalism, or something like that. Or they're family storytellers. And so, and I know that many students today that I talk to are looking for opportunities to explore their humanities, their art, their writing, through healthcare lenses, medicine in particular, is the students that I work with. Many of the scholars that I'll introduce to you are here. This is from the meeting that was in 2019. That was the last time that we were able to get together like that. And many of the students that I'll be presenting are here. Oh, whoops. And here's one, now Dr. Robert Colburn, who's a PGY2 in combined I think it's anatomy and neuropathology at University of Pennsylvania, presenting a project that was the design and implementation of the bioethics pathway that student designed and student run, student peer mentorship. One of the key ways that Kathy was able to stir discussion, conversation, create safe spaces where people could discover new allies, new collaborators, new research partners, or just friends, was through dinners that she would organize for, Kathy was very famous in the ethics field. She knew all the top luminaries nationally in bioethics, and they would come to campus. They would come only because of her. They would agree to come in person only because of her. And so this is just a sampling of some of the tools that she used to get people together. It was always over conversation. It was relaxed, and she brought in such a diverse group of individuals, medical students, in this case, graduate students, MD, PhDs, deans, former deans, visiting faculty from other campuses. I don't know if this pointer works, but just to give you a sense, this is the dynamic that allowed all of these new relationships and partnerships to happen. And in fact, on the upper left, on the row on the right, towards the back, there's Mr. Alfred Lacks Carter, right? That was at the last ethics dinner that we were able to do. It was right after the Cancer Disparities Symposium in March of 2020. That's organized by Dr. Martello Rooney. And Mr. Lacks Carter has come every year as one of the keynote speakers. I didn't have a chance to put up some other beautiful photographs of him with some of the students, but look around the table. We have a couple of them, I think residents at the time. We have graduate students. He came with his wife and his minister. So this is where conversations happen. This is where relationships can form and be strengthened. And you can't develop research projects, you can't partner to do ethics, to promote ethics equity, unless you have a strong foundation in strong relationships. So I'm going to present just a couple of words from the Connolly Scholars that were able to contribute something. They all regret being far away, being crazy busy, going to meetings, whatever, not to be able to be here in person. But I'm just going to present some of them to you now. I don't know, does this point? No. Does this point? I don't know if I can point, but I'll try to do my best. So Jenny Paredes, she's now Dr. Paredes is a postdoctoral fellow at Memorial Sloan Kettering at one of the top laboratories in the country studying hematopoietic malignancies. Where is she? She's in the blue with glasses on the upper, oh, and she's also right here. Dr. Connolly. Katya Merlukova, doctor, is a PGY3 at Harvard and a Harvard clinical fellow at Beth Israel Deaconess in pathology. She's wearing the cap on her head. She's next to Abi Omarnani, who's on the left on the top. Who else? Robert Colburn is in the middle in the top picture with the headphones, I think, around his neck. Michael Kupeli is on the upper right with the green sweater. Jack Hesberg is behind him and Jenny on the upper right. And they're all depicted. Oh, and there's Stan Soroka on the left, MD PhD student in Laura Martello Rooney's lab. And Jordi Chanovas, who's a PhD candidate in neuroscience. So again, with apologies for having to sort of cobble this together, I'm going to be presenting a couple of videos and reading some statements that they sent to me that they entrusted me to read. So I'll do my best. Let's try the videos first. Oh, we got them. Okay. I don't know if I do the video or it's upstairs. We can start with Abi on the left. I should also say, Abi, full disclosure, he was my student.
Hello all, thank you so much for inviting me to our ethics symposium. Hello all, thank you so much for inviting me to our ethics symposium. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Lazar, Dr. Roman. It's an honor to be here. Thank you, Dr. Lazar, Dr. Roman, and all. It's really been an invaluable experience working with the Connolly division. Invaluable experience working with the Connolly division. Dr. Powderly mentors was one of the most amazing and supportive mentors over the years at Downstate that I've ever had. I was over the years at Downstate. I both was able clinical to side learn as well as a research both side, from a clinical side as well as a research and side, humanities details, ethics that were and brought humanities through details, the division, the most important of which brought together through the division, the most important of which leaders in the field that came from all over the country, leaders in the field that came from all over the country, seminars not only for our late evening seminars that were for the entire, the fact that they educate us in our research coursework, to educate us in our research coursework, research for ethics, the research that we had in ethics. And beyond that, the narrative medicine aspect. And beyond that, the narrative medicine aspect immensely helpful for me clinically was immensely helpful for me clinically. Sessions that helped us with wellness, as well as sessions that helped us with wellness, for not only medical students but also residents. For not only medical students but also residents. So those experiences were the most important. So those experiences were the most important. Topic of the symposium. And then beyond that, our topic of the symposium now project that I did with Dr. reminds me of a project that I did with Dr. Martello Rooney that I probably wouldn't have been able to if it wasn't for really consider and work on. The most important aspect of it was really to focus on education. The most important aspect of it was really to focus on education with our patients and about understanding with our patients research about specifically when it came to collecting research, specifically when it came to collecting cancer tissues. So usually cancer tissues get collected as part of our clinical biopsies, but are disproportionately included in research studies and don't often include underrepresented minorities. And so part of our job was to work with our patients here and build a better patient clinician researcher relationship so that we could add to that knowledge gap and include more patient specimens from our patient population. Then that'll allow us to have better generalizability for our basic and translational research to our patient populations around here in Brooklyn. None of that could have been possible if through the ethics division I hadn't understood the IRB, I hadn't understood these limitations, and understood these aspects of equity. And so I really think that and all the other projects I'm going to do moving forward in my career, they're all based on the foundation that I had through our Connolly division, mentorship from Dr. Powderly and our ethics division overall. I'm really excited. Everyone's able to work on the ethics symposium now. I'm glad we can keep having them moving forward.
Hello everyone, my name is Robert Colburn. I'm a downstate graduate from the class of 2022 and a Connolly Scholar. I'm currently a PGY1 resident in anatomic pathology at the University of Pennsylvania, and I consider my experience learning bioethics from Dr. Kathleen Powderly and being part of the Connolly Scholars as critical.
It sounded fine on my computer.
In the shaping of my future as
I don't know what happened.
The field of pathology is one of the most prominent stories of health equity
that
exists in the public consciousness, and that is the story of Henrietta Lacks. As many know, she is a woman who suffered and passed from cervical cancer. Cells that were taken from a biopsy of that cervical cancer were stolen by clinicians and researchers and became one of the biggest modern advances in medicine, the helocell line.
Could you restart it,
This
please?
act had repercussions. Hello, everyone. My name is Robert Colburn. I'm a downstate graduate from the class of 2022 and a Connolly Scholar. I'm currently a PGY1 resident in anatomic pathology at the University of Pennsylvania, and I consider my experience learning bioethics from Dr. Kathleen Powderly and being part of the Connolly Scholars as critical in the shaping of my future as a pathologist. The field of pathology is ultimately and unfortunately plagued with one of the most prominent stories of health inequity that exists in the public consciousness, and that is the story of Henrietta Lacks. As many know, she is a woman who suffered and passed from cervical cancer. Cells that were taken from a biopsy of that cervical cancer were stolen by clinicians and researchers and became one of the biggest modern advances in medicine, the helocell line. This act had repercussions across the biomedical world, but ultimately had huge consequences for the family of Henrietta Lacks that were never truly rectified or acknowledged because this was considered an acceptable practice in the 1950s. Every bit of tissue that is taken from patients during surgical procedures passes through the pathology department, and therefore it serves as a paramount responsibility to safeguard and responsibly use this tissue in ways that provide patients with direct medical benefit while also simultaneously respecting their autonomy to participate in research. This is a decision that is made every day in the department, and it is our responsibility as clinicians and researchers to never forget that behind every specimen we receive is a patient that has placed their trust in us. My time as a Connolly Scholar and under Dr. Powderly's mentorship made these unforgettable lessons that continue to shape my work every day.
Okay. So I think, I was going to go backwards, sorry. So I think you've already heard that so much of what you've talked about is already sort of resonating in sort of the Connolly Scholar brain trust, if you want to call it that. So I'm going to read a couple of more statements. I think I have a little bit more time. One is going to be from Jenny Paredes, who texted me what she entrusted me to say on her behalf. So I asked her, because she said, when I first asked her, she said, sorry. She said, when I asked her if she could do this, and I thought I was going to cry, gosh darn it. Sorry, Kathy, not as strong as you. Okay. So she said, please, I love Dr. Powderly. You and her made my PhD training holistic and beautiful. How often do I hear that? I am doing this with love and gratitude. Jenny and I have talked a lot about her experience, particularly as a Latina woman. She's originally from Colombia, and she was a PhD student with Dr. Martello Rooney. And so she really was where the action was. As a PhD student, she was going to the surgical suites to collect specimens for studies on colon cancer. And, she would often share that, no one thought that she was a PhD student, right? Because PhD students didn't look like this brilliant young woman here. And that was a struggle. I remember going through the same thing. I mean, I may present a little bit differently, but I certainly read a lot differently when I was younger. And that's always a struggle. And the value of the space that Kathy created is that we could talk about that, right? We talk about resiliency and wellness. You know, you have to have a safe space to share these experiences. Our students are going into environments, as you said, it was agonizing to hear your words, but it's so true, Dr. Roberts. They can be inhospitable. It is unsustainable, and it is an existential challenge and call to action that these learning environments and clinical environments, they have to change. And if we're thinking about how do we change, we're the caretakers for our junior colleagues. And so a lot of that is to, how do we cultivate resiliency and provide tools and skills to walk through environments that don't meet the aspirations that we teach in our schools and colleges. How do we deal with that? And so that's the kind of work that was done. So I'll read a little bit more about what Jenny said. So she says, Dr. Paredes, I should say. She also wanted me to mention that as a cancer disparities researcher, Dr. Powderly's mentorship on how to ethically and professionally design consents and IRBs was crucial. And I think Abhi had said that as well. The training that I was privileged to have thanks to her. She also took tremendous value from the Health Disparity Symposium and conferences. And now she knows Mr. Alfred Lacks Carter. I'll read next from Dr. Merlukova, also known as Katya. And she writes, and this is actually written to Dr. Connolly, but I'll read it to you. In just a few months, I will begin working as a medical examiner in New York City. I'm beyond excited to begin this chapter in my career, but I cannot help but think of and be grateful for the bioethics training that I received as a Connolly Scholar. My job will be to protect society and to provide a voice for those who died too soon. It's a serious task. Coupled with the infancy of forensic medicine as an academic field, it's most important that we, who practice it, do so in the most ethical manner. And yet, our clinical training lags in helping us shape our concept of what ethical practice means. This is why I'm so grateful for the Connolly Scholar opportunity and for all of the mentorship that Dr. Powderly had given me throughout the years. What started out as a simple interest in learning about how decisions are made has evolved into an experience that continues to guide my daily practice of my craft. And I have you and Dr. Powderly to thank for this. Further, Dr. Powderly taught me the value in great mentorship, and it would make me very happy one day to be able to share bioethics training with my future trainees. Although Dr. Powderly is no longer with us, her spirit and her passion for ethics continue to live on through the Connolly Scholars program. Before I read the last statement, I just want to read a couple of excerpts from the President's Bulletin that was really the first document that gave a very sort of robust description of what the division did. And what the precipitating event was the Brooklyn Museum experience at the Frida Kahlo. So I will remind, and many of you may already know this, one section is pushing through the pandemic. When COVID first brought the world to a screeching halt, students were removed from clinical rotations and didactic education was optimized for remote learning. We all remember that. While the clinical component of their programs paused for the first quarter of 2020, students didn't waste a moment to identify how they can be of service during these challenging times, right? We love our students. This is why we come to work, right? And if patients, this is why we come to work. Led by two of our Connolly Scholars, Jack Hesberg, MD, PhD, and Anjali Jaiman, who's now an MD at Brown, and I'm sorry I don't have her listed here, students collectively worked out ways to develop scripts and called family members of patients who were not allowed in the hospital to see their loved ones because of infection control. They updated families, coordinated communication, and provided bereavement counseling. They also developed educational materials on COVID for the community and connected needy patients and families with food banks and other resources. Right? Katya, again, Dr. Merkulova, now she's a resident, spent weeks, this is what she did before she became a resident at Harvard, weeks working in the morgue, helping to connect families with their deceased loved ones. And Robert Colburn, who you just met, worked in the pathology lab with Dr. Libyan performing COVID testing on behalf of the downstate community. Other taglines: on the front lines of social justice, participating in events like White Coats for Black Lives Die-In, community partnerships. And I should also point out another graduate, MD graduate, Dr. Mafucci, Fenicia Mafucci, was the student designer of these art experiences at the Brooklyn Museum, and that was her ethics project with Dr. Powderly. All right, so I'm going to close with their words. And these were written by the other Connolly Scholars who came together to prepare this. So I'm just reading what they sent me. Good morning. Thank you very much to the organizers for inviting us to participate in today's event. As we come up on the first anniversary of Dr. Powderly's premature passing, we, the Connolly Scholars, would like to talk about Dr. Powderly's legacy, the inspirational role that the Connolly Scholar Program plays in our careers, and share our thoughts on applying research ethics to advance equity in healthcare. Dr. Powderly was a fierce, brilliant, and compassionate human being. In her role as a clinical ethicist, Dr. Powderly fought for the rights of disadvantaged and vulnerable members of our society. Her commitment to these underserved communities continued until her last breath. Literally, I visited her in the hospital. This is what she was talking about. My last conversation with her when she was in the hospital was about the scholars. What should we do next? What should we plan for? We experienced firsthand the extraordinary work Dr. Powderly accomplished, thanks to one of the projects she brought to fruition and established a community of impassioned students and faculty, the Connolly Scholars Program. The program was developed by Dr. Powderly with the guidance of Dr. Mark Stewart and Dr. Ian Taylor, and is kindly supported by the John Connolly Foundation for Ethics and Philosophy in Medicine. Connolly Scholars are students who have demonstrated a significant interest in ethical issues in medicine and science, and are selected from the MD, PhD, and MD, PhD programs at SUNY Downstate. This program gave us the opportunity to receive essential training that helped foster the range of experiences necessary to shape and continue to ethical medical practice and research as clinicians and scientists. The Connolly Scholars Program supported us in participating and presenting our work at international bioethics conferences and in further expanding our training in bioethics at institutions that Dr. Powderly collaborated with. Being a Connolly Scholar is one of the biggest honors of our lives, and we will be forever grateful to Dr. Powderly for her vision, her work, and her commitment to make us better human beings overall. She is sorely missed by all of us. Dr. Powder leaves an enormous legacy behind the Connolly Scholar Program. We are all looking forward to seeing the program grow and to welcoming new Connolly Scholars in the near future. Today's symposium discusses the importance of research ethics to work towards health equity. Health disparities affect those who are disadvantaged in our society. The predictive factors of health disparities include ethnicity, gender identity, and sexual orientation. Black, Indigenous, and people of color are more likely to suffer from health inequity. The same applies to women and the LGBTQ population. Research is fundamental to addressing this issue and is key to understanding the biological and sociological causes that contribute to health equity. Our learnings can be utilized to improve health and ultimately quality of life. However, a long history of discrimination and unethical practices imposed by the healthcare system onto these communities has led to distrust and stifled research participation by those who could benefit. Research leading to the improvement of these issues requires the participation of members of the communities that have been most impacted by health inequity, and achieving this goal demands an approach that respects the autonomy of the research participant. Engaging with the community, having open conversations, and bolstering trust with researchers are all key to achieving this. Acknowledging the long history of inequity and actively working towards correcting the travesties that it causes is not a moral luxury, but a moral obligation that we believe we have as clinicians and researchers. Thank you. Thank you for riding this through with me. I didn't expect to get emotional, but it's really the first time I've talked about my dear colleague, Dr. Powderly, in this way, and the dear students who are, we're very close. So I appreciate the opportunity. And so we're looking forward to continuing the work with you and having more of these. This was amazing. This was the most uplifting experience I've had in a long time. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Roman. And thank you, Connolly Scholars. Well, we've neared the conclusion of today's program, and I'd offer the following reflections. When Dean Brunicardi first came here in January 2020, he had 3 priorities: diversity, equity, inclusivity, professionalism, and wellness. And every day I think about his priorities and realize more and more that they are all interrelated. And I think that today's presentations exemplify the new levels of excellence that we have achieved. I'll refer back to Dr. Cristini's comment where he spoke of the fact that literally everything we do at Downstate is for the purpose of advancing health equity. And once again, I think today's program exemplifies that. Dr. Lambert, in his brilliant retelling of the plight of Henrietta Lacks, provided a historical perspective of the evolution of medical ethics. And while it's gratifying to see how far we've come, it's sobering to think of how far we have to go. Our IPE panel, which was so brilliantly moderated by Dr. Mackey, provided a shared learning approach with numerous pearls and tips for us to conduct research that will promote health equity. And I thank all of the brilliant panel members. They told us how to do it together in partnership. And they reminded us that as researchers, we need to be more mindful of the factors that influence health equity and to be more scientific because we all influence the researchers of tomorrow. Dr. Peterson, thank you. I think I finally understand GWAS, by the way. But I think more importantly, I understand the pitfalls of what's been done with GWAS and that 78% of all patients studied are from Europe. And they are not like the patients in our community. And I know, I'm confident that with your arrival, that will change. Congrats, Dr. Roman, and congrats to the Connolly Scholars. Connolly Scholars, you are our future, and the future is bright. I'd like to thank all of our presenters for their thoughtful presentation, our attendees, our live stream viewers, our wonderful audiovisual crew. Today's symposium was also recorded and it will be assessed via a link. Lastly, I'd like to thank the support of the John Connolly Foundation for Ethics and Philosophy in Medicine. I am pleased and honored that the legacy of Kathy Powderly will continue as the John Connolly Division of Bioethics and Humanities will be housed in the Department of Medical Education. So, applying research ethics to advance equity, Dean Brunicardi, Dean Cristini, Dr. Lambert, I contend we are Downstate strong. Thank you. Good day.